effect is far from boring. In fact, it's one of my favorite biochemistry examples of how things that are happening at the tiny little molecular level are really having a big impact. The Bohr effect basically explains pH dependent changes in the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. This makes it so that this molecule can pick up more oxygen in our lungs where there's a higher pH and more oxygen, and then in our toes and stuff where there's going to be a lower pH because we can't give off we can't just breathe out CO2. We're going to have a lower pH. This is going to reduce the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen and allow that hemoglobin to dump out oxygen where you need it. So we talked about how hemoglobin binds with positive cooperativity. So one oxygen binds, then a bunch bind. Well, this can be further tuned by the pH through the Bohr effect. And it happens because of changes that actually happen in the molecular level, with protonation offering up additional binding opportunities between the hemoglobin subunits. So really, really cool stuff. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about carbon monoxide, not so cool stuff, and things like that. So let's dive in. So remember, hemoglobin, that's our protein that is going to carry oxygen throughout our blood. It's a heterotetramer, so it has 4 subunits, 2 alpha subunits, and 2 beta subunits. And each of those is going to hold on to a heme, which is going to hold on to an iron, which is going to help it bind oxygen. Now, because we have those 4 oxygen binding sites, we have 4 opportunities to bind oxygen. And what happens is that the first opportunity is going to be a lot harder than all the subsequent ones because hemoglobin demonstrates positive cooperativity. So once one of the oxygen binds to one site, it's going to make it easier for oxygen to bind to the other site. As a consequence, what's going to happen is we get a sigmoidal binding curve, even on a linear scale. We're at higher oxygen concentrations, which is often measured as partial pressure. You're going to have a higher affinity, and so the hemoglobin is going to bind more. And at lower oxygen concentrations, you're going to have a weaker affinity, and so the oxygen is going to bind less. You're going to offload the oxygen where you need it and take it up where you have a lot of it. Remember our key terms. We had allostery. That was something that happens at one location of a molecule, such as the binding of oxygen to one of the sites, that affects what happens somewhere else in that molecule, such as making the hemoglobin change shape so that those other binding sites have a higher affinity. Remember, we can use the term modulator to describe a ligand, so a binding partner that causes allostery and affects the binding of ligands. This can be negative, which would mean that its binding decreases affinity for subsequent ligands, or positive, whereas it increases the affinity for subsequent ligands to bind. We further described how we could refer to these as homotropic if their modulator affects the binding of a copy of the same ligand, or if it was heterotropic, so it affected the binding of a different ligand. So what type of modulator is oxygen acting as? Right, oxygen is going to be acting as a homotropic positive modulator. Homotropic because it's affecting the binding of subsequent oxygen molecules, and positive modulator because the binding of one oxygen molecule increases the affinity for further binding. We saw how this came down to structural changes in the hemoglobin protein. Hemoglobin has those 2 main states, the T state, the taut state, and the R state, the relaxed state. So remember, the relaxed state is going to be the state that binds to oxygen. Think R, think of red, think of the oxygen being red. So that R state is going to be that's bound to oxygen. You can also think about you're more relaxed if you have oxygen, right? So this is going to be the relaxed form. It's somewhat confusing looking because what's going to happen is you kind of have it more condensed looking in the relaxed form than in the taut form. But the taut form is called taut because it's going to involve more of these salt bridges between the different subunits. But it will have a bigger hole in the central cavity. But the taut stage, this is basically your weaker binding affinity, and then the relaxed stage where you have a higher binding affinity. And what happens is that when you bind that first oxygen, you stabilize the R state, making the higher affinity for the subsequent sites to bind. As a result, in your lungs, where there's lots of oxygen, you're going to be in that R form. And then in your toes, you're going to be in that T form. So remember that if you have no oxygen, then you have a little oxygen bind. What's going to happen is that that's going to increase the binding affinity for further oxygen. So you're going to quickly saturate. Then when you're in your lungs, you're going to stay at that very high percentage. But then when you go the reverse direction, because remember this binding is reversible, well, now if you decrease the oxygen concentration to say the concentration that you would find in your tissues, well, now you're going to have a lower affinity. So you're going to end up offloading a lot of oxygen into the tissues that need it. And having this cooperativity allows you to do that. Whereas if you were only in the T state all the time, you wouldn't be able to pick up enough in your lungs. And if you were only in the R state all the time, then you wouldn't be able to give off enough in your tissues. But by having this positive cooperativity, we're able to do this. We saw how this was caused structurally by allosteric changes that occur when oxygen binds. Remember that heme has that kind of like porphyrin ring thing. And what's going to happen is it's kind of puckered when oxygen isn't bound. But when oxygen binds, it kind of flattens it out. And when it does this, it kind of pulls on the amino acids that are making contact with that iron. And so it's going to pull this alpha helix, which is going to pull the stuff that's around it. And as an end result, you get this conformational change where the entire protein is changing shape. So remember that this protein kind of all folded up all nicely, and now you're making a change, and so the protein has to adjust. It happens mainly through these few key residues like histidines that are interacting with that lysine, and so we'll look more at those in class. But bottom line, you end up with this T form and this R form, and these different forms are going to have different affinity for oxygen. So basically, you bind to the oxygen, you cause that pulling, you change the shape of hemoglobin. This makes it so that the other oxygen binding sites have a higher affinity for further binding of oxygen. But if you release that oxygen, well, now what's going to happen is you're kind of going to get shifted to that top form. In that top form, you're going to have these salt bridges form that we'll look at. And then this is going to stabilize this form that has a lower affinity for oxygen. So you only need that single binding event to kind of help shift the balance and stabilize it in one form or the other. So if you bind one oxygen, you quickly transfer into the state that you can bind more oxygen. But if you release one oxygen, you get to the T state where you're going to release more oxygen. Exactly what we need. And when we're in this mid-range, small changes in PO2 can make a big difference. So even if someone has low oxygen, we can give them oxygen and quickly help restore their hemoglobin carrying capacity, their oxygen in their blood. But we'll talk about some things that can actually prevent this, some medical consequences, things like carbon monoxide poisoning. So we talked about how oxygen was going to be a positive homotropic modulator. But then we talked about another modulator. We talked about a modulator called 2,3-BPG or 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. You might also see it like 2,3-DPG for diphosphoglycerate. Basically, it is kind of like a byproduct of glycolysis. So glycolysis is one of the ways that our body breaks down sugar. And there's this molecule, we'll get way more into it when we talk about metabolism, and you don't need to know the details of this right now, but basically there's this molecule 1,3-biphosphoglycerate that can kind of get sidetracked and take this alternative route and become shift to become 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Bottom line, when your cells are undergoing glycolysis, they create this some of this 2,3-BPG, and that 2,3-BPG can act as a modulator of oxygen binding. Remember, we looked and we saw how binding of 2,3-BPG stabilizes the T state, decreasing affinity for oxygen. So on top, we have the T state, and you can see, remember, it had that bigger central channel, and that's going to be where the BPG binds. And we looked last time at how there were salt bridges that were helping this binding interaction. And then we had the R state, where it's more collapsed. There's not room for that BPG there. So what happens is that if BPG binds, now it's going to stabilize this T state. And the T state, remember, is the state with a lower affinity for oxygen. So what's going to happen is that when you have 2,3-BPG around, you're going to have decreased affinity for oxygen. So what type of modulator is BPG acting as? So BPG is acting as a heterotropic negative modulator. Heterotropic because it's affecting the binding of a different ligand. So BPG binding is affecting the binding of oxygen, and it's a negative modulator because it's reducing the affinity of oxygen. And this has important consequences, and it helps our bodies further fine-tune the amount of oxygen that is bound by hemoglobin. At high altitudes, there's less oxygen in the air, so there's a lower partial pressure of oxygen at, say, 4,500 meters versus sea level. As a consequence, even if you take up all the oxygen that's available in that air, you're going to be starting with a lower amount than if you are at sea level. Well, now what's going to happen if you have the same affinity for hemoglobin as for oxygen as you had before when you're in your tissues, because that concentration of oxygen isn't changing. Well, now what's going to happen is you'd be releasing a smaller amount of oxygen, offloading that less oxygen than you would if you had started out with more oxygen. But if you had a lower affinity, you could release more, and this could help compensate. And we saw how we could have a lower affinity by increasing the concentration of 2,3-BPG. So people at higher altitudes make more 2,3-BPG, and this is going to help compensate for that oxygen, for not having enough oxygen to begin with, allowing them to still offload a similar amount of oxygen in their tissues. We also saw how basically in fetal hemoglobin, they had a different, instead of a beta chain, they had like a gamma chain. And this is going to have a weaker affinity for that BPG. This is going to make it so that their hemoglobin has a higher affinity of oxygen, which is going to allow it to bind to more oxygen and really take all the oxygen they can get out of the blood. Because remember, they have to be like taking the leftovers after it's already been kind of used by the mother. Okay, so yeah, and HbF, that just stands for fetal hemoglobin, versus HbA, which is the adult hemoglobin. So you can see that fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen to start with. And then the BPG, it's less affected by the BPG than the adult hemoglobin is. And this is because you're not forming those salt bridge interactions, because there are amino acid differences in those sites, the different versions of the hemoglobin chains. So we saw how we had oxygen acting as a positive homotropic modulator and BPG acting as a negative heterotropic modulator. Now let's talk about a different way that we can affect affinity, and this is called the Bohr effect. So it was originally described by Christian Bohr with Hasselhoff and Krog in 1904, and the original paper is in German, but you can find like a translation of it that I can link to. What they found was that you got a change in the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen depending on the pH. More specifically, at a lower pH, there was a lower affinity for oxygen, whereas at a higher pH, there was going to be a higher affinity for oxygen. So in black, if you just have normal, if you then lower your pH, then what's going to happen is you're going to get a shift to the right. Remember that a shift to the right is basically saying you need more oxygen for half of it to be bound, whereas a shift to the left is saying you need less for it to be bound. So at a lower pH, we have a lower affinity, and at a higher pH, we have a higher affinity. And remember that even little changes in the numbers for pH can correspond to big changes in the amount of protons available. And so this can actually have a pretty dramatic effect, even for small little changes in the pH. So to understand why this is actually happening, and we want to understand why this is happening because it's super duper freaking cool, basically what's going to happen is the Bohr effect is going to involve interactions between these, between the alpha and the beta chains that are going to help stabilize the top form and be pH dependent. What happens is that in the T form, you're going to have salt bridges. So remember, those are ionic bonds that are going to form between the chains. So remember, we have those alpha and the beta chains. What we're looking at here is part of the one of the beta chains. And this His 146 is going to be the C terminus. You don't need to know all the names of all of these amino acids. Like which specific ones are interacting. This is more just to kind of like give you a look at the type of interactions that can, like the actual biochemical molecular basis for physiological things that are super duper important to real life. So again, don't worry about all these details, but just kind of try to take it all in, how awesome it is. So basically what's going to happen is that, so this is the C terminus of the chain. Remember, that's like the end of the chain because we talk about proteins as going from end to C terminus. And what's going to happen is that over here, there's going to be this aspartate 94. Aspartate, remember, that's one of our acidic amino acids, and histidine, that's one of our basic amino acids. So the two of these can form a salt bridge. And what this is going to do is it's going to orient the C terminus of that beta chain towards a lysine on the other chain, so on the alpha chain. So you have this lysine sticking out, and then you have the C terminus that's directly oriented to form a nice salt bridge with it. So you get a salt bridge here that helps orient you to form a salt bridge here. But remember that histidine, it only had a pKr of about 6. And so it was predominantly going to be in its neutral state. And so in order for this reaction to actually happen, though, histidine needs to be in its positively charged state. So if there aren't enough protons around, then you're not going to get this BB interaction. And what's going to happen is that you're then going to be too far, the histidine is going to be too far away. So even though it's got its C terminus, it's like all the way over here, as opposed to over here where it needs to be to interact with this lysine. Now you're all the way over here. That is not going to be able to form a salt bridge. So in that R state, you're not going to be able to form that salt bridge, but in the T state, you are. But in order to form that salt bridge, that histidine has to be positively charged so that it can then interact with this aspartate to position that C terminus to interact with the lysine. So basically, in the top form, you can have these interactions form, but they depend on histidine being protonated. If histidine is not protonated, you can't form those stabilizing interactions between the chain, and so you end up being in the relaxed form. So what's going to dictate whether histidine is protonated or not? Well, that's going to be its pKa and the pH. So remember the pKa, we talk about like approximate pKa's, and you can find those in a table. And so the pKa for histidine side chain, so remember we can also refer to a pKa for a side chain as a pKr. So histidine is traditionally about 6, which means that at a pH of 6, half of it would be in its protonated form and thus positive, and half of it would be in its deprotonated neutral form. If we're at a pH of 7.4, so basically most of it is going to be in its neutral form, which isn't going to be very useful to us. But if we can raise that pKa, then we can have more of it protonated. And if we lower the pH, we can have more of it protonated. And so we're going to be able to do both of these things. So we have our aspartate. And remember, our aspartate is negatively charged. So how do you think it might affect the his 146's pKr? Is it going to raise it, lower it, or have no effect? Having that aspartate 94 is going to raise the pKr of histidine. Basically, it's going to stabilize the negative charge on histidine and help make it more favorable, less likely to give back that proton if it takes it, and therefore you're going to have a higher pKr. So this is going to make it so that histidine is easier to protonate, but it still needs to have protons available. And so where do those protons going to come from? The bloody bicarbonate buffer system. So basically you don't need to know all the details of this bicarbonate buffer system, but your body has ways to control the pH of your blood and of your everything. And one of these main ways is through the bicarbonate buffer system. What happens is that when you have CO2, such as can be released when your cells are doing all their energy making. So we have like cellular respiration, which we'll talk about a lot more. But basically, there's this part of it called the citric acid cycle. And in that citric acid cycle, you're going to be releasing this carbon dioxide. So when your tissues are working hard, you're going to be producing carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide is then going to react with the water with the help of this super duper cool enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. That carbon dioxide is going to react with the water to form carbonic acid and bicarbonate. And so, fun fact, carbonic anhydrase is one of the speediest enzymes known. It can combine CO2 with water to make carbonic acid, or do the reverse 1 million times per second, which is 10 million times faster than it would happen on its own. So I hope this gets you excited about our upcoming section on enzymes, because this is just like one of the coolest ones. But anyway, the significance of this is that when you form that reaction, when that carbonic acid deprotonates, it releases protons. And when we have more protons, well, now we lower the pH. Your body has ways to compensate in order to keep it steady by like changing the breathing and the kidneys in order to compensate. But what we really care about for our purposes here is that you have water react with carbon dioxide to give you carbonic acid, which can deprotonate to give you bicarbonate, producing protons. So carbon dioxide, more carbon dioxide, lower pH. And the significance of this is then remember that when we have that lower pH, there are more protons available. If there are more protons available, then our histidine is going to be protonated. If our histidine is going to be protonated, then it can form those salt bridges that stabilize the T state, and this is going to then promote the offloading of oxygen. And this is really, really great because, well, in our lungs, say, we have plenty of oxygen and we're able to give off the CO2 because we can just breathe it out. But if we're down in our toes where we're doing a lot of energy making and producing CO2, but we can't just like breathe it out of our toes. Basically, what's going to happen is then our CO2 is going to build up. We're going to get a higher proton concentration. That's going to protonate the histidine, going to make it so that you can form those salt bridges, stabilize that T state, and dump off the oxygen. Then when that hemoglobin goes and it travels back to the lungs, well, now there's going to be less CO2. You're going to have more oxygen. The oxygen is going to bind. So you're going to basically, without the CO2, now you can't form those salt bridges. You have a higher oxygen, so you can bind to oxygen. Once you bind to oxygen, well, now you're quickly going to stabilize that R state and increase the affinity, allowing you to uptake oxygen. Remember, T state is going to be that taut state where each time oxygen and hemoglobin meet, they have a lower probability of sticking. So they need to meet more in order to get the same amount of binding. So you get your curve shifted to the right. In that R state, however, they're more likely to stick each time they meet, so they don't need to meet as much in order to get the same amount of binding. And so this is going to be shifted to the left. And this could be explained in terms of those histidine being protonated and allowing it to form those interactions, but that's actually only part of the story. CO2 is actually also going to kind of directly stabilize things by offering up new opportunities for salt bridges to form where they wouldn't normally. So basically that carbon dioxide can react with the amino terminal residue, and this can make a carbamino terminal residue. So you're taking what was like a positively charged N-terminus and you're turning it into a negatively charged site. When you have something negative, well, now it can form a salt bridge with something positive. So what's going to happen is that then you can get a salt bridge forming in a new salt bridge forming that you wouldn't have had before. And at the same time, what's going to happen is you're going to be giving up a proton, you're going to be lowering the pH. So the bicarbonate system is only like one of the ways. It's the main way that your body like transports CO2, but the other way is through hemoglobin itself. And so by reacting with hemoglobin, you're releasing more protons and you're kind of making it so that there are additional interactions that can form that stabilize that T state. Fun fact, like hyperventilation, you know how they say to breathe into a paper bag? Well, there's actually a biochemical reason for this. What happens is when you hyperventilate, you are basically going to be you're breathing out too much CO2 without taking in enough oxygen. Without that CO2, well, now you don't have that pH lowering, and without that pH lowering, your hemoglobin isn't going to shift to that lower affinity state. And so you're not going to be giving off as much oxygen as you need in your tissues. But if you breathe into a paper bag, what's going to happen is it's going to force you to rebreathe in that carbon dioxide, allowing that to then lower the pH, allow those salt bridges to form, and stabilize that T state that's going to release the oxygen where you need it. Another fun fact, again, you don't need to know this, but it's just really cool. And since a lot of you are like pre-med and stuff, I thought I'd go just touch on it really briefly. So basically that 2,3-BPG, remember that's a product of our glycolysis. So glycolysis is this sugar breakdown phase of our like metabolism, and you can go on after that to enter the TCA, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, where you make all that CO2 and stuff. But that requires oxygen, and even if there's not oxygen around, so you have like anaerobic conditions, you can still go through glycolysis. And when you do so, basically what's going to happen is you're going to be generating more of that 2,3-BPG. But if you're not going through the rest of the respiration cycle, if you're in anaerobic conditions, now what's going to happen is you're not going to be producing that CO2. So what are the consequences? Well, if you don't have that CO2, you're not going to be having that Bohr effect lowering power, where you're getting the lower pH is going to lower the affinity. But remember, BPG was also a way we could lower the affinity. So if you're doing a lot of energy making under anaerobic conditions, you're still going to be able to reduce the hemoglobin affinity, so you can now flow oxygen in those tissues. Okay, so that was like cool stuff about hemoglobin. Let's talk about some of the not so cool stuff, or I mean, some of the bad things that can happen. One of the worst is binding to carbon monoxide. So we are not talking about carbon dioxide here. Carbon dioxide was helping us before. Carbon monoxide is not going to help us like ever, which is why we have to have those like carbon monoxide sensors in our houses. Basically, carbon monoxide is also going to bind to hemoglobin, but with super duper high affinity. So we're talking like 200 to 300 times the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And what it's going to do is it's going to stabilize the R form. So remember, the R form is the one that wants oxygen. So what would its dissociation curve look like if it has this really high affinity? Go ahead and sketch it out on your sheet. Basically, you would expect it to have something like this, where you have a really, it's still sigmoidal because basically you're going to stabilize the states then. So you bind one, you shift it to the R state, and then you quickly bind a bunch more. And so what you're going to get is a curve that's something like this. Now, how would carbon monoxide binding affect oxygen binding at the remaining sites? So that curve was like if we were to bind to all of the, like all 4 subunits with carbon monoxide. But say you only had 2 subunits, 2 carbon monoxides bind to the hemoglobin, leaving you with 2 sites open for oxygen. How would that oxygen binding affinity be affected? Would it be higher, lower, or unchanged? It would be higher because you're stabilizing that R state. Remember, carbon monoxide is going to stabilize that high affinity state. And so you're quickly going to be taking up the oxygen as well as just this carbon monoxide. So you might think, oh, that's not too bad. I mean, you're still binding oxygen, right? Well, there are a couple problems. One is that you have fewer sites available. So if you had carbon monoxide around, well, then it's taking up some of oxygen sites, and therefore oxygen can't bind there. And because it's binding so tightly, oxygen can't really have a chance of competing it off unless you have a ton of oxygen around, which is why people have to give like really high pressure oxygen if to counterbalance carbon monoxide poisoning. Another problem is that we just said that we're going to increase the affinity for oxygen. And we talked about all these different ways with like the Bohr effect and BPG, where we could lower the affinity for oxygen. And so here we're talking about a really tight affinity for oxygen. So if you had 50% of your hemoglobin bound to carbon monoxide, so like 50% of the sites, how would this affect the oxygen dissociation curve? Go ahead and sketch it out. Remember to take into account that we'll have a lower total amount binding, as well as that we're going to have a tighter affinity. So hopefully you drew something like this. Basically, this is going to be in this 50% state. What you can see is that your Bmax, like the maximum binding, the maximum saturation of your hemoglobin is only going to be half of what it was before. But what's going to happen too is that your curve is going to be shifted to the left. You have a higher affinity for that oxygen. And so now what's going to happen is if you compare the PO2 in the lungs, so you start with a lot less than you would, you start with like half the amount as you would if you had no carbon monoxide. But now, hardly difference between the affinity in your lungs and the affinity in your tissue, because remember that carbon monoxide, once it binds, like you're shifted to that R state, and it's not going to shift away until you unbind. And that binding has a super high affinity, so you're not going to have much of a chance of actually offloading that oxygen. As a result, you get very, very little change in the oxygen bound in your lungs versus in your tissues. And so you're not releasing oxygen where it's needed. So you can compare this to what would happen in like an anemic individual. So if they have like 50% of their normal blood cell capacity, they would only be able to bind to 50% as much oxygen as a normal person. And similarly to if you had 50% of the sites occupied by carbon monoxide. But what's going to happen with them is they're still going to get their normal cooperativity because all their sites are being bound by oxygen. And so they're going to get oxygen still going to be released into the tissues. But in the case of carbon monoxide bound, well, here the affinity is too tight. And so the carbon monoxide is not going to, the carbon monoxide is stabilizing that oxygen bound state. And so the oxygen bound state is going to have a higher affinity. You're going to have to get to lower oxygen, partial pressures of oxygen in order to release it, lower partial pressures of oxygen than you actually have in your tissues. And so you're not going to be releasing that carbon monoxide, and you're not going to be releasing that oxygen. Speaking of anemia, one other cool thing about hemoglobin, which doesn't really relate to what we're talking about that much, but sickle cell anemia. This is a disease caused by a mutation in the hemoglobin protein, and it's this E6V mutation. So what does E6V tell us? Remember how we talk about amino acid notation, mutation? Right, it's going to tell us that the sixth amino acid in the hemoglobin chain is swapped from a glutamate to a valine. Now, what do we know about these amino acids? How do we classify glutamate? Right, glutamate is an acidic amino acid. It's hydrophilic, it likes hanging out with water, and so it would be happy on the surface. What about valine? How do we classify valine? Right, valine is one of the nonpolar amino acids. It's hydrophobic. Normally, it's found somewhere buried in the center of a protein. So what's going to happen if we change something hydrophilic and charged to something hydrophobic, nonpolar? Now what's going to happen, you put this nonpolar thing on the surface of a protein, and it's not going to be very happy. But if it finds another nonpolar patch on another hemoglobin unit, well, then they can link together. And so what's going to happen is you get these abnormal hemoglobins that link up to form long fibers. These can then twist together in long helical structures that cause red blood cells to get misshapen and clog blood vessels. This polymerization is favored in the low oxygen state. It's easier for those interactions to be made in the low oxygen state. Remember, that's our T state. So as the cells are going to go like cycling throughout the body, they keep polymerizing and depolymerizing and depolymerizing and unpolymerizing over and over again, majorly stressing out the cells. So this is what happens with sickle cell anemia. The discovery of sickle cell anemia, like the molecular cause of it, is like super duper awesome. And so I will post links to more about this. But basically, Linus Pauling and friends, basically they found that because you're changing a negative charge to neutral, you're going to change the overall charge of hemoglobin. And remember, what's the term that we use when we describe when we're talking about like comparing protein charges and what charge it would be at what pH? Yeah, we use that term isoelectric point, or PI. So if we're changing from a glutamate, one of those acidic, to a nonpolar, how is this going to affect the PI? Is it going to raise it? Is it going to lower it? Or is it not going to have any effect? Right, we're going to raise the PI, we're going to raise the isoelectric point. And so if you use electricity to separate proteins by charge, well, now you can then separate these proteins, and they were able to find that there was a molecular difference between the hemoglobins using this technique. And then they were able to further do peptide fingerprinting things where they kind of like chopped up the protein and looked at what amino acids were in it in order to determine the actual genetic basis and the protein basis. So it was like super duper cool. Speaking of super duper cool, let's review hemoglobin. So remember, it's got those 4 binding sites, and it binds with positive cooperativity, meaning that if one oxygen binds, then the rest of them are going to bind quickly. And if one lets go, then the others are going to quickly follow. As a result, you get this sigmoidal binding curve, sigmoidal even on a linear scale. And basically, where at higher oxygen concentrations, you're going to have a higher affinity for oxygen, and at lower oxygen concentrations, you're going to have a lower affinity for oxygen. As a result, you're basically able to take up oxygen in your lungs and release it in your tissues. This is helped along by the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect is going to be this pH-dependent effect, where you're going to get stabilizing salt bridges form in the stabilize the top phase, which is going to be that oxygen offloading phase, that low affinity phase. Those are going to be dependent on a histidine being protonated, and that's going to be dependent on how many protons are around. Well, how many protons are around? That's going to depend on the pH, and the pH is going to depend on how much carbon dioxide there is. The more carbon dioxide there is, the lower the pH, the more you stabilize that offloading state. And where would you find these conditions? Well, you would find them in tissues that aren't able to expel carbon dioxide easily, but are producing a lot of it and don't have much oxygen. So that was where you would find this in the tissues where you need oxygen the most. You need it to be offloaded the most. So that's perfect. In our lungs, we've got plenty of oxygen. We're able to expel out that CO2 easily just by breathing it out. So we're going to have a higher pH. We're going to be stabilized in that oxygen-loving R form. And then this is going to allow us to take up the oxygen without giving it off too soon. So at a lower pH, which we can get by having a higher CO2, we have a lower affinity for oxygen. And if we have a higher pH, we have lower CO2, we have a higher affinity for oxygen. And hopefully now you appreciate the molecular basis of this, and then in class we'll investigate things more. Remember, you don't need to know all the details. You definitely don't need to know all the numbers of the amino acids that are interacting, but more of just kind of seeing the principles of how you can have a protein undergo various allosteric effects. You can have allosteric modulators. You can have things like cooperativity. And all of this can be explained at the molecular level, at the biochemical level, using all that pH stuff, all that amino acid stuff that I know you guys love so much, right?